It's good to be here with you. I have many friends here at Westside. I remember stories over the years. I was here when you ordained your first minister, almost 20 years ago. I don't need to tell you that Westside is in a challenging time, one of transition. You know that better than I. Your minister left last fall after helping this congregation experience a tremendous growth surge. Concerns that you all will lose momentum are not unrealistic. Yes, you will have challenges, but Russell's successors may well take you to even greater levels. Consider that. I've come here today to tell stories of individuals as well as First Unitarian Church of Dallas, of those who have faced adversity and still managed to thrive, past the bottle of flooding pumpkins compound. Hopefully you'll hear something today that will give you a sense of renewal, inspiration, or optimism. One place I learned that techniques and that reservoir of resilience was at leadership school. I've been to our district's version of that twice. The first way back when in its fourth year, before it was even named Dwight Brown Leadership Experience. The second, a few years ago, was more like taking a drink from a garden hose than from a fire hydrant. But in '92, one way we coped with that deluge of concept and material was our ritual of telling light bulb jokes. We did all the standards. One to hold the bulb and million to turn the world. And of course, variations on the beloved electrical committee. We also wrote some new ones, and I thought I would share with you because anyone else's sparked your delight. So, how many UUs does it take to change a light bulb? Well, we can't do that. How many UUs does it take to change a light bulb? I'm so glad you asked. At least half a dozen. One to facilitate, some to carry out the task, and someone else to explain the process. Perhaps the light bulb doesn't need changing at all, and we need to re-examine our own expectations. After study, we might see that the light bulb has merely evolved, and to attempt external change might actually harm the eco-cycle of said light bulb. The exact number hasn't been determined because the first question is the very existence of light. Even if we do manage to agree, we may not want to change the light bulb to avoid alienating those who use some other form of illumination. And could you be more specific when you say change? Finally, one of my favorites, we don't need light bulbs. We like chalices. It was both ironic and distressing that we knew the jokes, but few people knew the history of the flaming chalice. Over the past 60, 70 years, it has become widely used as a denominational symbol. It is printed on and worn about just about everything. For 6 centuries, actually coming up in July, it will be 599 years. It has stood as a symbol of truth and a beacon of liberty. Now, I have to thank Judith Walker-Riggs, from whom I learned the story, some of the details, but don't worry, you only get the Cliff Note version today. Jan Hus was a Czech priest ordained in 1400 and was a Roman Catholic to his dying day, as well as a radical who laid much of the groundwork for Martin Luther and the Reformation. From his church in Prague, he preached in the native language on the issues of the day and of the morality and goodness of the people. He also passed the communion chalice to the parishioners as well as the priests. Because in that day, only the priest got the wine of the communion. This implied that they might actually be equal. These were all revolutionary concepts threatening the hierarchy. Despite great personal danger, Huss stood firm as he challenged the establishment for more than a decade. After a sham trial, he was burnt at the stake, but not before he made a pun on his name. In Czech, it means goose. He said, "Today you may be burning a goose, but from my ashes shall rise a swan you will never kill." Hence we have the flame for our chalice. The first flame is his ideals live on to guide us today. We religious liberals trace our heritage back to those who faced extreme challenges. As well as Huss, there were others who were martyred. Catherine Weigel, Michael Servetus, Francis David, Faustus Asinus, George de Benneville narrowly escaped. These roots were all integral to the founding of our nation. Also, because after all, if we're going to do away with the king's government, why should we tolerate his religion? But that's another sermon, I think. Universalist founder John Murray also knew adversity, having lost a wife and young child, then spending time in a British debtor's prison because of his medical debts. He came to these shores to escape religion and leave it all behind him. But he ended up establishing a church in Gloucester, Massachusetts, which went on to win the first ruling for religious liberty in this country, 1786, before the Constitution. And they won an exemption from paying taxes to support the parish church, which, as the majority church of the state, ran the schools. Now, if we had this same system here, the Southern Baptists might actually be in charge of the Texas schools, and we would just pay our money directly to them. Anyone who, and you thought Robin Hood was problematic? That would be a little more contentious. There were many others who fought the good fight. Judith Sargent Murray helped her husband found the Universalist Church of America, but she also produced many groundbreaking writings of her own. Horace Mann toiled for many years on what would become the model for our public school system in the country when he held up the Massachusetts schools. Clara Barton embodied the American Red Cross. Dorothea Dix dedicated her life to mental health care and spent her last few years as a guest in a mental hospital. She had a private suite provided by the grateful system. Susan B. Anthony, synonymous with women's suffrage, declared, "Failure is impossible." And Ida Cannon devoted her life to fighting TB, which had taken her mother, but also she established the field of medical social work and the case management system. That took some dedication, which she had plenty of, and she reluctantly retired at the age of 68 because they told her to. Theodore Parker was a fervent abolitionist who sheltered runaway slaves and felt safer sleeping with a pistol under his pillow. Senators Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun fought and compromised to maintain the Union and prevent the Civil War. Meanwhile, in California, Thomas Starr King was credited with saving California for the Union. He did so almost single-handedly with his preaching, and raised $1.5 million for the Sanitary Commission for health care for the soldiers. P.P. Barnum captured folks' imaginations while he fleeced their pockets. He recovered several times from near ruin and gave generously to support and establish Tufts University, where the mascot is an elephant named Jumbo. And in Dallas, First Church Dallas, there have been highs and lows in our history. Founded in 1899, it grew steadily for 3 decades. Outgrowing the sort of rental spaces in the first building, one high point was in 1921 when Rabindranath Tagore spoke. He was the first Indian to win the Nobel Prize. When he spoke in 21, Betsy Yost was there. I remember her telling about that. She was a child then, and said that his flowing white robes and his long hair and his sandals were quite a sight in downtown Dallas. I think that same would be true today. The record books tell us that there were 600 people in the sanctuary, another 500 outside, 400 that evening. I'm a little doubtful. The sanctuary could not have been twice the size of this building. I don't know that you could stack 600 people in here or not. But I also ask, what about here? What have been some of the big events and major speakers in this congregation? Tough times did lie ahead for First Church. In the spring of 26, the minister took ill and died. The rabbi filled the pulpit the first 2 weeks, but then they went for a year with guest speakers. 2 years into the Great Depression, the congregation had to shut its doors. They'd been very dependent on a few wealthy individuals, and when those people fell on hard times, the institution nearly collapsed. It was the Women's Alliance who kept us together. They maintained the telephone tree, they maintained the charter, and helped us with rental space when we started back up in 1938. Harvey Sanders was a pillar of the church. He and Betty helped us learn from this lesson because they would often give in challenge grants to challenge others to give freely and generously. With all this, we went on. The 40s and 50s, era of McCarthyism and the Cold War, were a time of sustained growth for the church, though not without adversity. Men and women attended sermons so they could take notes on the service, on what was said. The FBI monitored our telephones. We grew in spite of and because of those challenges, partly because the minister, Robert Rabel, or as people called him, Daddy Bob, did not give up. Another pillar of the church was Louise Raggio. She and Greer had come to Dallas shortly after World War II and founded First Unitarian. They found in the pulpit this preacher who, according to Louise's conservative Lutheran upbringing, was saying things that were going to land him in hell. They stayed. This support network proved vital when Greer was fired from the government for being a communist, when he got rehired. They couldn't say anything about this, but the church was important to them. It was a vital support network. Daddy Bob and Levi Ola, the rabbi, were the only two in town, the only two clergy who did not stop preaching against the witch hunts. She described that they were both small physically, but they would shake their fists and say, "This is wrong!" And they kept on. Greer Raggio was another one who kept going on. He was soon rehired, though he left as soon as he was able to start his own law firm and would do civil liberties work throughout the 1950s. That's why in November of 1963 he was called by headquarters of the ACLU to go represent someone named Lee Harvey Oswald. He went because everyone needs representation. But Louise told him he was not going alone. Two church members escorted him to that first and only hearing. Meanwhile, Louise went off and got her law degree and made such little changes as the Texas law that allows married women, to sign legal contracts and open checking accounts. That was in 1967. These are just two of our beloved activists who have helped us go on. Daddy Bob retired in 1964, and we had some tough years at a time when Dallas really needed a strong liberal presence. Remember, this was the city where John Birch Society had its headquarters, where Eli Stevenson was attacked, hit over the head with the sign, LBJ and Lady Bird were spat on, and this was the city that killed Kennedy. Lisa Jenkins is now a ministerial intern at Horizon Church and tells that her 5th grade classroom erupted into cheers upon hearing that JFK had been assassinated. Often a lonely voice for liberalism, we went on. Now, after the glory days of the Daddy Bob years, First Unitarian had a time of more lows than highs. Our first choice for minister had to decline because of illness. We ended up with a former priest who wasn't ready for ministry. While he had discarded anything resembling Christian theology, he still tried to run for his Unitarian like a Roman Catholic church. You can imagine how that went. For that reason and others, we had to fire him after 2.5 years. Some people said 2 weeks, but we gave him 30 days notice. It wasn't easy, but we went on after learning a hard lesson. Now, for some practical words, a few ways for you to avoid that kind of situation. Get to know as many VU ministers as you can, for comparison as well as finding some you really like. Watch their sermons online, read their work, if nothing else, the meditation manuals. Skinner Press puts out one every year through the bookstore. Attend conferences whenever you can. Get to know Unitarian Universalists in other cities, so unlike us, you don't have to rely on the recommendation of a congregation that just wants to see their minister move on. Visit congregations whenever you travel, to hear varieties of sermons and assorted ministers, and to become familiar with other worship philosophies. Finally, be patient with the interim process. There's a lot of work in articulating new directions and selecting a minister, and please be open to change. You might surprise yourself with how much you like a new person. Back at Dallas, after the failed ministry, there were a few good years with Dwight Brown. Then another minister who was not a good fit and only stayed 2 years, evidence that 80% is not enough when making a call to minister. 90% vote is a good minimum, or even 95%. Social action presented quite a few challenges in the 80s with deep disagreement over the sanctuary movement and being the nuclear-free zone. The congregational meeting for that vote had included some nasty name-calling in the sanctuary. We forgot our covenant for a while, but we went on. There was also high turnover and experimentation in the religious education department. We sometimes went on an interesting journey. But by 1980, things were in pretty bad shape. John Buren said that when he arrived in August of 81, half the staff had been laid off, there was $3,000 in the bank, and each and every one of the skylights leaked, all around the sanctuary. There are buckets everywhere. He had to type his own orders of service until a volunteer stepped forward. Thankfully, things are better now, and we go on. It is so important to go on, to be a presence in today's complicated and contradictory culture, to be a presence for people like Pickett in today's reading. In the Pacific Northwest, as Amy's going to be able to tell us about, you might be asked if or why you go to church. But here, the question is where you go to church. And if you answer you don't, woe unto you. Your career is hindered, you get isolated, stigmatized, and you'll never get admitted into the Junior League. But I don't need to tell you that if you lived here in the South. Like many of you, I need my church as I go on in today's world. A story on me, if I may. Some years ago, I was asking myself, what had helped in my own personal growth? Two things immediately came to mind, one of which was the blessing and unconditional acceptance of my church, particularly by heterosexual men, something that I missed out on as of growing up. Now, stories from First Church that I can personally tell, and Susan may help on this. Remember, I've only been there 26 years. Tom Irvin was a loyal and dedicated member when I got there. He sang in the choir as well as serving on the board, and as a volunteer basis, he was organist for 7 years. When he took ill in the late 80s, the church stepped forward. Board members brought him meals and scrubbed his floors. Alice Horn probably didn't do her own laundry, but she did his, and his mended with her own hands as testament to her friend. The nurses were amazed that he did not go into the hospital until his last 2 weeks. But it was the care group of 165 people over that year and a half that made it possible. Towards the end, we did suffer through some pretty awful hymn play. But we were tolerant because Tom's music was one of the things keeping him alive. Remembering him and others, the congregation goes on. There were other friends. Carol Benson said that church is where they have to let me sing. It was, yes. Janetta Sergison helped run the book cart, volunteering until the day she died at 87. In a time when I'd seen several friends die of AIDS, I remember feeling grateful that I was able to attend the service of someone who had lived a long, full and happy life. There are multitudes of memories. The Christmas pageant every year, hanging of the greens, those of us who make dinner for staff on Christmas Eve, variety of classes, youth lock-ins, staffing the donut table, weddings, coffee houses, graduating seniors, and many a potluck. Then there was December of 1991. I won't forget it. On Sunday morning, it was announced that the interim minister was leaving. He was not ready for ministry. That afternoon, it was discovered that the former treasurer of the church, he was the trustee who was heading up the long-range task force, had committed suicide. The next day, a niece of one of our members was one of 4 girls murdered in an Austin store. It was difficult, but we soldiered on. And it was that week that the president of the church gave birth. Nothing else to do. And on Thursday, showed off her daughter, her newborn daughter, to board members who had gathered and so they could process Rick's death. On Sunday morning, as we dedicated a new chalice, Reverend Holman wove together the human life cycle, along with some history, as she preached infant hope and steady light. And we went on. There have been some high points in the past decade or two. In December of '99, we went back to Temple Emmanuel for our centennial service. This time we counted, there were 875 people attending. We did not lose people with Laura Holman's retirement. Membership is over 1,000. We have 2 called ministers, along with lots of other folks on staff, though there will always be budget challenges. We also recently built a new wing for offices and classrooms with, think of it, 5 adult RE rooms. 4 years ago, we installed Daniel Cantor as senior minister with about 600 people in a sanctuary that if we get real cozy and squeeze in, we can see 500. And we called Aaron White his associate with a vote of 351 to 0. Unanimous. I can't tell you exactly but we're going on with worship, education, and social action to help enrich people's lives. Finally, let me say I'm not in favor of growth, just to be big. But larger numbers tell us that we are reaching people who need to hear the word, people who hunger for the good news of Unitarian Universalism. That's another sermon. Let me reiterate, I do not promote growth for its own sake, which can create an air of desperation, but growth is a natural outcome for a healthy and effective congregation. After all, if you have strong, vibrant programming, people will come and join. If you don't, why not? Aren't you worth it? Or to restate it, if you are not growing, you are dying. I like to quote the late Suzanne Meyer, do you love your church so much you're ready to take it to your grave? So now I close with a challenge and a question. I ask you to listen to each other as you tell the stories, the high and low points of what this congregation and maybe others has been, what it has done, what it has meant to you and to this community. I also want you to share your dreams, what this congregation can be, in what ways can it grow, and how can it touch people's lives. How can you and those yet to come through the doors, ministers and lay people, build on the foundation Russell and others have laid. Now, in the words used for decades to close the prayer of First Church, we ask this in the names of all those known and unknown, present and absent, remembered and forgotten. We ask this, we pray, in the names of all the helpers of humanity. Let us now sing hymn number 318, We Will Be One.